Hello, this is Sarah Braasch. Welcome back to my channel. So I want to do a video about Cuties, the French film that's on Netflix that everyone is up in arms about. So I'm probably going to do a few videos about this. So I have what I think is a pretty unique and I think insightful take on the film. And I did a blog post about this already, which was very well received. And the reason why I have what I think is a pretty unique and insightful take on the film is because I spent a year in Paris, France, in the banlieue, and those are the suburbs, the housing projects, in the ghettoized suburbs, the predominantly Muslim immigrant communities in the ghettoized suburbs, in the housing projects in France, surrounding the major cities of France, including Paris. And so I spent time with Ni Pute Ni Soumise, and Ni Pute Ni Soumise is this really extraordinary, really fierce women's rights organization in France. And it was born in the early 2000s, and it was born as a response to the egregious violence being perpetrated against the women and girls of those communities in the ghettoized suburban housing projects surrounding the major cities of France. And actually, Fadela Amara, who was the first president of Ni Pute Ni Soumise, she led a 40-day march across France, ending in front of the French Parliament. And this was in response to a young girl, Sohan was her name. She was 17 and she was burned alive, and she died by an ex-boyfriend in one of the housing projects, behind a dumpster in one of the housing projects in one of the ghettoized suburbs and near Paris. And so that was when Ni Pute Ni Soumise was born, and it translates as neither whores nor submissives, roughly, from French. And they are an amazing organization. So I spent a year working with them as a human rights fellow, and this was following my graduation in the spring of 2009 from Fordham Law School. And then I also took the bar exam that summer, and then the day after I had completed the bar exam in New York City, I got on a plane and I left for Paris. And I spent the next year in Paris, France with Ni Pute Ni Soumise. Now, spring 2009, if people remember, or if you're not aware, that was the spring when the bottom fell out of the legal profession, especially for attorneys like myself who always wanted to be and went to law school and racked up all those law school loans and all that debt, because I wanted to be a human and civil rights attorney. I wanted to work for a nonprofit. I wanted to work for a human rights organization, etc. So this was a particularly tough time for us, because what happened was all of these people who had been summer associates and had commitments from law firms, from huge law firms in New York City, etc., what they did, because they had no work for these new associates to whom they had promised, associate jobs, and so what they did is they said, well, you go away for a year or two and we'll pay half or 2/3 of your salary, whatever it was, which is still pretty good, right? If your starting salary is $200,000 for an associate attorney position in a law firm, big law firm in New York City, then half or 2/3 is still a lot of money. So they were said, well, we'll pay you half of your salary. You go away for a year or two because we have no work for you, and you can go work at a human or civil rights organization, a nonprofit, and we'll pay you half your salary. So all of them did this. So what that means, of course, you understand, is that there were no jobs for people like me who actually went to law school because they actually wanted to be human rights attorneys and civil rights attorneys. So it was a really tough time. So anyway, what happened is I actually was so lucky because I was awarded a fellowship from Fordham Law School to go work for any human rights organization in the world that I wanted to go work for a year, and they paid me a salary. It was not a lot, but I was perfectly happy to be paid anything to go work for a human rights organization for a year. That was great. So I had done some research, and when I submitted my application, I said I want to go work with Soumises and in Paris, France. So they're an amazing organization, and I'm so sad because I don't think that they really exist anymore. And a French newspaper published recently that it's the end of an era, and it truly is the end of an era. So I told you how they got started in the early 2000s. So when I went to work for them, it was basically August, September 2009 to August, September 2010 is when I was in Paris working with Ni Putes Ni Soumises in the banlieue and the housing projects around Paris. So they're an amazing organization. They have 3 pillars to their organization. It is secularism, but it's the strict French version thereof, a very strict separation between church and state, and then also gender equality and gender desegregation. So they take a very French view towards the public space, where full, free, and unfettered access to the public space is part and parcel of your French citizenship. And they take an uncompromising stance on women's rights as universal human rights. They are against cultural relativism. They are against political Islamism. They think that women can only be fully citizen and have full access to their human and civil rights and their citizenship rights under a secular government. So they have a very firm commitment to secularism as one of the pillars of their organization, even though most of the women who, at the time worked for this organization came from those predominantly Muslim immigrant communities, backgrounds. Most of them were Muslim. Some of the women wore hijab, and they were very happy to march alongside their brethren for their rights and against racism. But at the same time, they said, we take an uncompromising stance on the women's citizenship, their human rights, and they were born out of a response to the egregious violence that was, and still is, but definitely was being perpetrated against women and girls in those communities. So anyway, I had an amazing experience with them, and I was there at a particularly amazing time. So in 2010, what we would do is we would pretty much every week, we would go out to the suburbs and we would march because a woman had been burned alive by her husband in front of her children, or a woman had been raped and murdered, or there was a playwright who put on a play and she was attacked in the street because she was actually Algerian, she was from Algeria, and she was there putting on a play about Muslim women's oppression, the oppression of Muslim women. And so these are the kinds of things that we did. And pretty much every week we would go out to one of the housing projects, to one of the suburbs, and we would march and we would chant, and we would be filmed by, television stations and cable networks. And so this is what we did. And then, and it was a fabulous experience. And so it was also a really interesting time because it was when the French Parliament was considering the anti-face mask law, which is colloquially known as the burqa ban. And so Ni Putes Ni Soumises supported the burqa ban, supported a ban on burqas. And this is something that I've talked about a lot. I need to do more videos about this and talk about more. And so I support burqa bans as well. And the reason why, just like as ni Pute ni Soumise saw them, they saw them as public desegregation measures. And remember, they take a very French view of the public space, that full access to the public space is part and parcel of your citizenship, and they take an uncompromising position on that as well, and there's just no room for negotiation. And so desegregation, public desegregation, desegregation of the public space, both racial desegregation and gender desegregation are extremely important to them. And so they see a burqa ban as a public desegregation measure. And they see it as guaranteeing full French citizenship for French women, including Muslim immigrant women. And so they see it basically as like the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the US. It's a civil rights measure, it's a public desegregation measure, and I see it that way as well. And I'll talk more about that in other videos. I've talked about that and I'll talk more about that. But that is, I developed that position, of course, while I was there with Ni Pute ni Soumise when the debate about the anti-face mask law was happening, about the burqa ban. And I marched with them in faux burqas up to in front of the French Parliament. It was an amazing experience. And we actually went to the Place de la République, and there's a huge statue there of Marianne, who is the symbol of the French Republic and symbol of French Republican values. We placed a huge black burqa over her, and I have video and I have photos of all of this, and it was the most incredible and amazing experience. So something else that I did, and then in the midst of all of that debate about the burqa ban, we actually went to one of these inner ring suburbs, and we had a town hall meeting, and it was with some women in niqab, people that were there that, of course, the Pute ni Soumise in support of the burqa ban, and then there were other people there against the burqa ban. There were women there in niqab against the burqa ban, and it was at an elementary school, and I was filming it for Ni Pute ni Soumise, and it kept erupting into violence, and people kept grabbing each other and pushing and shoving, and I got really scared. And at one point when it erupted into violence and I was filming, and it's really funny because the video, you just see my feet, and you just see my feet like scurry towards the side door. It's pretty funny. Anyway, I'll have to show that to you guys, but anyway, it's pretty funny. But so I scurried out this side door because I got scared, right? My fight or flight mode took over, and I went into flight mode, and I flew out of there as fast as I could. So anyway, so I was standing outside looking into the room through the windows, these huge windows, and there was a woman standing next to me in hijab, and she grabbed my hand and she said, "Oh, c'est chaud," meaning like, oh, things are getting crazy in there, things are getting heated in there, because it kept like, they kept grabbing one another and pushing and shoving. And I just thought, well, thank goodness we're not in the US, because I'm sure someone probably would have pulled out a gun and started shooting people. So anyway, so that was one of the things that happened. So it was a really fascinating time to be there with them. So one of the other things that I did, and when I first started watching Cuties, I started watching it because Misfit Poise on Twitter, we follow each other, and she was doing kind of like a live tweeting while she was watching it. And so I got really interested in her reaction to it, because I had heard that it was basically like a snuff film with starring very young girls, but for pedophiles. Like, I just heard it was like the most horrible thing ever. So she was live tweeting it, and she was having a very different kind of reaction to the film. And so I decided that I wanted to see it. So I started watching it, and I hadn't realized that it was a French film, and I hadn't realized that it was set in the housing projects of the suburbs around Paris. I didn't know that. It looks like, the film to me looks like an inner ring suburb. It doesn't look like one of the outer suburbs that are really far flung, and you have to take like a bus and a train and a bus to get to them. So anyway, so I was shocked when I found out that it was a French film, and I was shocked when I found out that it was set in the suburbs around Paris, which is where I worked with Ni Pute Ni Soumise. So that's why I feel like I have a very unique and specific take on the film, and I have an insightful take on the film. So another thing that happened, oh, and then when we were at this debate in the elementary school in the inner ring suburb that kept erupting into violence, so Lubna Ahmed Al-Hussein was there with us. And she is, and I worked with her a lot when I was at Ni Pute Ni Soumise. She was being sheltered by Ni Pute Ni Soumise. She had fled the Sudan in a burqa. So anyway, she was the Sudanese UN worker. And I believe she's also a journalist, and she's a human rights activist, but she worked for the UN as well. And so anyway, she was the one who was sentenced to 40 lashes of a whip for wearing pants in Khartoum. You'll probably remember hearing about that. Lubna Ahmed Al-Hussein. And she was so lovely and so wonderful, and it was such a pleasure getting to know her and getting to work with her. And she had a book, which is, I think basically that's the title of the book, like 40 lashes for wearing pants or something like that. And she signed it for me in Arabic. I asked her to sign it in Arabic. She actually didn't speak French, but she spoke some English and then Arabic, of course. But that's why I worked with her quite a bit, because obviously I'm an English speaker, and it was really great fun. And I tried actually to make arrangements for her to come visit the United States, but it didn't end up working out, but I did try. But anyway, so she was there at that debate, and I did a lot of things with her with Ni Pute Ni Soumise. So one other thing I did at Ni Pute Ni Soumise is that I actually corralled together a group of international interns who were all working at Ni Pute Ni Soumise, and we would go out to the suburbs, to the housing projects in the suburbs, the predominantly Muslim immigrant housing projects in the suburbs. And I had put together a questionnaire in French and Arabic. I don't speak Arabic. I didn't speak Arabic. I got someone to translate it for me. But, and it was all of these questions about the access of the women and girls to their sexual and reproductive health care and rights. And we asked them all of these really intimate personal questions. How many abortions have you had? How many times have you used the morning after pill? Do you go to the gynecologist regularly? Just all of these questions about their access to sexual and reproductive health care. And so we put together this survey, and I put together this group of international interns that were at Ni Pute Ni Soumise, and then we would take a train and a bus and another bus, and we went out to these really far-flung suburbs, these far-flung, crumbling, huge, behemoth housing projects out in these far-flung suburbs around Paris. And these were the suburbs where also I need to watch Les Miserables, is the Academy Award nominated French film. It was recently nominated for an Academy Award, and it's also based in the suburbs. And now people are very interested in the suburbs because in France, with the housing projects in the suburbs that are predominantly African, Muslim, immigrant communities, they have a lot of the same kind of issues that we're experiencing now in the US. I mean, that we've always experienced, but that have, basically, come to a head, and this is why we're having so much unrest in the US. And so the same thing happened in France in these suburbs, these depressed, ghettoized suburbs. So in 2005 and 2007, I think there were some later too, but in 2005 and 2007 they had riots, and people burned cars, and they just rioted, and they just destroyed things in their own communities, but and it was in response to young African Muslim immigrant men dying at the hands of the French police. So not at all dissimilar to what is happening now here in the United States. So they had rioting, and so we went specifically to those suburbs. We went to those suburbs, and we would just stand on a street corner. I had spoken with the sociologist Phil Zuckerman, and I had just asked him, I said, okay, I want to do this sociological study. How do I do that? And he was like, oh my goodness. But then he just said, well, the best thing you can do to make it random, and just go stand on a street corner and talk to whoever walks by. So we only wanted to talk to the women and girls, but we did that. We just stood on a street corner near the housing project or near the mosque, and we would just speak to whichever women and girls that walked by. And it was a little bit dangerous. Some of the areas were more dangerous than others. We tried not to arouse the notice of the men. When the men did take notice of us and did even approach us, we would just pretend to be like stupid American college girls who didn't know what we were doing, and we were just working on a college project, and then they would just be like, oh, you're idiots, you're nobody, and then they would just walk away. But then we would usually just leave once the men of the community had taken notice of us. But these places are places that still erupt, intermittently in unrest because of, all of the racism and the, very fraught relationship between the French government and these Muslim immigrant communities. And so there sometimes, the bus drivers intermittently will refuse to drive their routes through these communities because it can be quite dangerous for them, especially, after dark, etc. So we just had the most amazing experience, though. I have a treasure trove, a literal treasure trove, of data that I acquired. And most of the women, or it depended on which suburb we were in, whether it was an inner or an outer ring suburb. We definitely wanted to go to the ones where they had the unrest from 2005 and 2007, and we did go to those suburbs. But there were, there was variation. There was definitely variation. But in a lot of the suburbs, most of the women would be in hijab. Occasionally someone in niqab, but usually it was hijab or chador. And so, but we just had the most amazing response from the women and girls. Everyone was so happy to talk to us. Everyone was so happy to talk to us. They wanted to chat with us. I have a veritable treasure trove of data. I have a treasure trove of data. And so a lot of them couldn't read, but they were just like, oh, go ahead and just ask me the questions out loud. They didn't care who was around. They didn't care about giving their answers of these really intimate and personal questions about their sexual and reproductive health care and lives, and they didn't care about telling us their answers out loud, and they would answer all of the questions. And I have over 200 responses, and so when I've just been sitting on this treasure trove of data for a decade, basically. And so when I was taking statistics in the psychology department at Yale from Jack Dovidio, who's quite a famous professor and statistician and psychologist, and so I told him about this treasure trove of data I had. And so for my final project for his class, I did a really rudimentary analysis of this data. And what I ended up doing was I really wanted to answer a particular question, and I found statistically significant results, and I wanted to find out about a preference for emergency contraception over regular oral contraceptives, particularly for young women and particularly for young Muslim immigrant women in these communities. And I did find a statistically significant preference for for emergency contraception over regular oral contraceptives and the birth control pill, basically. And the reason why, they kept telling me this. They kept saying, I just use emergency contraception, the morning after pill, basically, as my primary form of birth control because it's easier to hide from my family. And I kept hearing this, particularly from young Muslim immigrant women who still lived with their families out in the housing projects in the suburbs around Paris. So that was amazing to do that. It was absolutely amazing, and I want to do more analysis on this data. I have a treasure trove of data, and I have barely even scratched the surface in terms of the statistical analysis that I could do with this data, and I know that there's so much amazing information in there. So I need to continue doing that and write about it. So that was such a seminal, like, eye-opening, deeply profound experience, life-changing experience for me, of course. And then it mirrored the experience that I had during law school when I spent the summer in Rabat, Morocco, with the Moroccan Organization for Human Rights. And when I was there by myself. I was working for the Moroccan Organization for Human Rights, and I really wanted to talk to, again, the women and girls. I really wanted to talk to them about their sex lives and their access to sexual and reproductive health care and rights. And I was also studying the recently modified family law of Morocco. And so I actually had befriended this group of young men who worked at these, like, internet and telephone cafes in the city center of Rabat. And then there was sort of like this group of, these were like really sort of, upper middle class men. That was the kind of background that they had. And then what I would do is I would just let people, everybody wanted to take me home with them, for dinner and for tea and even to spend the night. And I would just let people take me home with them. I would just, because I wanted to get inside their houses so that I could talk to the women and girls about their lives. And I had one in particular, most amazing experience, which really mirrors the experience I had in the housing projects in the suburbs around Paris, is that I had dinner with this family. And the mother I was there with a girlfriend of a friend of one of the young men whom I had befriended in Rabat. And I went home and met her family and had dinner with them. And her mother, the young woman was probably in her mid-20s. And she was the youngest child of this quite elderly woman. And she only spoke Arabic, but the daughter would translate into French for me. And it was the most amazing experience. It was just really like, she really wanted to tell me about, like, her life story and everything she'd been through. And of course I was very happy to hear it. So we were sitting there watching, like, an MTV channel, and we were watching this video. Was like, I don't know, I can't remember, but it was like a rap video or whatever. And it just had, like, all of these, girls on the beach in thongs, gyrating and rubbing up against young men and each other and all that good stuff. So anyway, so the mother, this quite elderly woman, very proper Moroccan woman in Rabat, she was laughing uproariously watching this video. She thought it was so funny. And so I was asking her what she thought about it, and she said, she just seemed completely unfazed by it. She just said, oh, that's for the young. That's not for me. That's for the young. And then she was telling me about her life. And so she had been married when she was a very young girl to a much older man, her husband, who was actually in the next room while we were chatting. And she said that she was so young that she wasn't very good at cooking and cleaning. And so her husband, she said, her husband would beat her mercilessly, and her sister had to come and help her and teach her how to cook and clean so that her husband wouldn't beat her anymore. And she had so many children. She had children from a very young age. And this young woman in her mid-20s was this elderly woman's youngest daughter. And she had all of these children also that had moved to France and were living in France. And she was so proud of all of her children, and she showed me pictures of all of her children. And that really was something that I was told over and over and over again by the young people in Rabat, Morocco, is that they were just, everybody was just trying to get to France somehow, some way, anyway. The goal was always to get to France, get to France, get to France, so that they could, work and make money and send money home to their families in Morocco. And so anyway, so this I was talking to this woman, and then afterwards, it got late and I ended up spending the night. And so the young woman and I were sleeping in one room on these couches, and then the older married couple were in this other room. And the young woman actually showed me where she hid her birth control pills from her mother. And I thought, that just really struck me that there's this openness to the habits and the dress and the demonstrably very sexual behavior in modern society. But then at the same time, the daughter felt like she needed to hide her birth control pills from her mother. She didn't want her mother to know that she was having premarital sex with her boyfriend. And anyway, so we were, and that was another thing that the older woman had told me, was that she didn't hold a grudge. She didn't hold any grudge against her husband, that she was very happy. She loved her husband, even though he, her life had been very difficult, and he had made her life very difficult, and she was so happy, and she loved all of her children, and she was so proud of her children. And so she seemed very happy. She seemed very happy with her life at that point. And so we could actually sort of hear the older married couple sort of cooing at each other and giggling in the next room. And then their daughter said to me, she sort of whispered to me, and she said, oh, the lovebirds, cooing at each other, or something like that. And so it just really struck me. So the reason why I'm telling you about all of these experiences that I had is because this very much, of course, informed my response to Cuties. And this video is getting really, really long. But anyway, so I'll do more videos. I'll do more videos about this. So my response, I actually felt quite gratified, because I read that in an interview, the director who came from one of these Muslim immigrant communities, who came from this background in France, in Paris, she said that what the movie was really about was the relationship between the mothers and the daughters, and what it means for a young girl like Amy to straddle two cultures, the African Muslim immigrant Senegalese culture, and then also to want to be part of modern and secular libertine France. And so what it means to straddle these two cultures, and and that the mother in the movie told the grandmother, leave my daughter alone, while the daughter was dressed very provocatively in one of her little, almost non-existent little dance outfits. And the mother told the daughter, you don't have to come to your father's wedding. He was marrying a much younger second wife. And this was after the mother, along with her mother, the grandmother, had performed like an exorcism on the girl, and it seemed like she had a local imam come and make sure that the girl wasn't possessed by demons, and etc. So it was sort of this, it paralleled the experience that I had in the housing projects in the suburbs of Paris, and then also the experience I had in Rabat, Morocco, where it was that as long as you're maintaining your virginity, and as long as you're maintaining your chastity, you can dress very sexy. You can even act very sexy to a point. You can dress very sexy. You can embrace, modern and secular libertine France and the French culture, and you can do that. But your behavior, you have to abide by the sexual mores of the immigrant culture, of the African culture, of the Muslim culture. You cannot actually be having sex. You can dress like a whore, but you cannot actually be having sex. And there seems to be a very clear line in the sand on that point. And that was one other thing that when we went around to the suburbs and interviewed women and girls, and there was a lot of variation, and in some of the suburbs, you know, we would interview young girls in blue jeans with uncovered heads, you know, hanging out outside the McDonald's, and they just wanted to be French girls like any other French girl, and they just wanted to enjoy their beauty and their youth and their freedom. And so yeah, it was amazing. So I had a very specific response to Cuties, and of course I'm gonna wrap up because this is getting really long. I'll do more videos. I just want to say, of course I understand why people found certain scenes in the movie so disturbing, but I also don't think that they were unrealistic, in that I felt like it was a really realistic depiction of the life of a young girl like Amy living in a housing project in the suburb of Paris, and her wanting so desperately to be part of, you know, the French culture around her. And that's another thing I'll do a video about, is that, you know, she just floundered and flailed a bit, and because she didn't understand any of the social conventions. And I had a very similar experience growing up, because I grew up in a very insular, misogynistic religious called the Jehovah's Witnesses, but then I went to public school, and all I wanted was to be the beautiful, cool girl, and the beautiful, sexy, cool girl. And the last thing I was the beautiful, sexy, cool girl. But that's what I wanted desperately, and I didn't understand anyone's social conventions. I had no idea what was going on. I made a fool of myself every day. So anyway, I have so much more to talk about, but I had a very specific reaction to the film, obviously, because of my personal experiences, and I have so much more that I want to say, but I'm going to wrap up there because this is getting really long. Okay, I will do more videos about Cuties, but this will just be the first one. Okay, I'll have my PayPal me and GoFundMe links below. Please donate to my legal fund. I love you all so much for all of your support. Have a great night. I'll talk to you later.